welcome to Your Career. Ahead, we'll get some advice on how to delegate to others, and we'll speak to two women who made their careers in law family-friendly by starting their own firm. But first, effective communication in the workplace is a cornerstone of success. However, getting a message heard and understood and tackling some difficult conversations with confidence are skills that many people lack. After all, who hasn't resorted to a cowardly email or text when it's time to share some negative feedback or some bad news? Well, joining us today for more is Professor Anne Brewer, the Dean of Professional and Continuing Education at the University of Sydney, and Kamal, who is the Managing Director of leadership development firm Resilium and author of new book, The Art of WinWin Conversations. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Kamal, I might start with you, because your book's called Win-win.
Yep.
What does that actually mean?
So what we find is, especially in large corporates, a lot of people are not having win-win conversations. They're having win-lose conversations. So what that means is their boss or their client says something and they felt like they've lost. And there's the other time where you have a lose-win conversation where you just say, okay, you're the boss, or you're the client, I'll just accept it. A win-win conversation is where you come together as equals and you get an outcome that's mutually beneficial.
And don't most people who go into a conversation like that, even if it is a boss and their employee, want both players to win?
You'd think that, but unfortunately there's these subtle power games being played.
Yep.
And these subtle power games go back to us with our parents or at school, where we had the teacher at the top and us being the student, or the parent at the top and us being at the bottom. And we've learned how to communicate like that. But what we found is that society is becoming more egalitarian, but the way we communicate isn't.
So, Anne, you teach a course called How to Conduct Difficult Conversations. What do you find are the sort of topics that people find hardest to communicate about at work?
Asking for a pay rise, asking for a promotion, asking for anything that might be a change in their work conditions, giving negative feedback, the boss having to talk about change of policy, but also broaching conflict or broaching inappropriate behaviour. I think they're the things. And I think the main reasons people find it difficult is that they're fearful of the consequences of the difficult conversation, or they're fearful in not getting what they want, or for some it's about trying to please too much of the time.
But I mean, consequences of avoiding that communication can be quite dire, right? Come on.
Yeah. So what happens is you get a lot of disengagement. So the consequences of not having a win-win conversation, or the important conversation you need to, at one end is bullying, and at the other end is disengagement. And none of those are really powerful for the business. So you have to broach those quickly, but you have to have the bench strength going in that that no matter what comes out, you can turn it into a win-win. So for example, what Anne said is, asking for a pay rise. How do you do it in a way that it's a win for the organisation, a win for the boss and win for you, or asking for a promotion? You have to have a new skill set to do that, and unfortunately we're not taught that.
But there are times when it is important to avoid a conversation, particularly if you're feeling highly emotional. And so sometimes at that point you might want to stall and send a polite email, not to deal with the issue, but you don't want them to see or hear the anger or emotion in your voice. So there are times when you might avoid it, but it's very few. What's really important is when you avoid a conversation is that the relationship weakens, mistrust sets in, and it can actually lead to the avoidance can lead to more conflict.
So if you do have a conflict at work then, in what way do you approach it? I mean, how do you approach your boss?
So I think one of the biggest things is, when we talk about win-win conversation, is the deep needs versus a superficial want. So if you can understand what the deep need is, like to a certain degree your boss actually wants to keep their job, they want their bonus, they want to make sure they look good in front of their superiors. You have to address those kind of issues rather than the superficial want, and also a promotion could sometimes be a superficial want. It might be the need to feel valued, the need to have career prospects. If you can peel back the onion and get to the deeper needs, that's where you can find the win-win, and then you work up from there.
I mean, I would agree with that. I think it's really, what do I want? Why do I want it? Am I going to be speaking with the right person, having the conversation with the right person? When should I be having that conversation, and how should I be having it?
Do you need to, though, look at how it might benefit them?
Oh, definitely. I think it's very important for you to understand what it is they want out of it, why they might want it, and for you to actually almost use them as a mirror, because in understanding where they're coming from, it's going to help you establish your argument and negotiate with them better.
And you need to have a sense of sort of formalities when you have these discussions. I mean, you don't want to communicate right like you would in a social environment.
Correct. So I think it depends what the purpose of the conversation is. If you're about to dismiss somebody, you're not going to take them to the coffee shop. It's going to be in a more formal setting. However, if you are having a conflict with them, it may be that you're best to go to the pub after work or a coffee shop, at least to start the initial conversation. But there's a point at which now we have to formalise it. So it's really where you are, what the issue is, and where you are, and how many times have you broached it before. Depends on the context, I think.
Kamal, is it also a matter of choosing your language appropriately? I mean, do you want to sort of do rehearsals for some of these discussions, or does that make it too rigid?
You do, but I think one of the biggest things that people are looking for is authenticity, and people can smell the fluff. People know when you're trying to game it, and I think more and more we're getting fed up of the cliches, and you see politicians all the time. You know, they're scripted, but then in a loose moment, boom, the reality comes out. So I think it's more important to have that intention of win-win and that intention of equality. And because people smell, you know, the nonsense, the rubbish, and they cut through it very quickly. And we're fed up of the cliches.
And they smell it because we give it away non-verbally. In other words, our non-verbal behaviour, our body language, our posture, our facial expressions, even the tone of voice is not aligned or consistent with our message. So when Kamal says they smell it, they're actually detecting it, because as we know, something like 60% of meaning is coming through the body, about 30% is coming through our tone of voice, and only 10% in terms of what we're saying.
The content. So what sort of body language do you need to use in order to portray the right message?
Well, it depends who you're speaking with.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's important. It's about physical distance. It's about the tone of voice, not because that's important. Not letting it rise, keeping it moderated, depending on what the situation is. Facial expressions, eye gaze, eye contact. But it depends who you're speaking with, because again, there's cross-cultural issues in all of that.
I think the point about it's almost irrelevant sometimes what you say. What's really important is how the other person received it.
Yeah.
So if you're working in Indonesia, say that might be very different from working in, say, the US, because a word, something might be interpreted differently. What we find a lot of people doing is orchestrating exactly what they're going to say, but not really conscious of how that's been received. So you need to close that feedback loop and making sure you don't focus on the message sent, but the message received and how that's been processed.
So I guess in terms of getting your message right, what are some of the key pillars of communication? What are the key sort of things you need to know?
I guess one of the biggest things is actually don't speak too much. What we find with leaders is we found them speaking 80% of the time when we videotape them. I think it's really important to create that void that other people fill. So we create the distinction between speaking at somebody, which is one way, versus a conversation, which is two-way, versus communication, where you're trying to not listen to the words, but listen what's not being said. But what we're really looking for is connection. So I think the more you can connect with another person, it's almost really irrelevant what you say if you have that connection. If you don't have that connection, no matter if you say the right words, you're going to get further and further apart.
So it's listening as well.
Listening is very important. Kamal is talking about the pause. People are rushed to fill the gap in the conversation, and sometimes it's very important to ask your question, an open question, and pause and wait for the response.
What about when you get pushback? So if you've gone in for a difficult conversation and you know, it might be a boss or a colleague and they give you pushback, do you have to be careful in the way you respond so it doesn't sound like you're sort of fighting back, Kamal?
Yeah, look, I think when we looked at WinWin Conversations, we took a martial arts analogy. And so there's two types of martial arts. Like there's one like karate, when you hit somebody, they're coming at you. The other approach to martial arts is like Aikido, where you use their energy and you guide that energy. If somebody's coming at you, if you meet force with force, like if you get louder and, you know, more aggressive, you're going to have a lose-lose conversation. So it's really important to try to use their energy and help channel it. What we've got this technique about making the other person try and say yes. What you need to do is make them feel heard. Once you can make them feel heard, they're more likely to be less aggressive.
I think that's it's about acknowledgement of them, their position, building that rapport, asking open questions. reflecting back. So if they sound aggressive, you could ask a question back, reflecting back, or say to them, even in the beginning, yes, so that you're getting them to talk about their feelings. Why do they feel annoyed about this? Why this is going to be, you might start off by saying this is a sensitive issue, or I feel bad about talking to you about this, but I need to ask. The other thing is giving them permission to say no.
What if you've got a difficult colleague, though, and it's sort of their problem, their personality issue? How do you deal with that from your perspective? Can you still have a win-win conversation if they've got a sort of personality, if it's their personality that's sort of giving the wrong signals?
So what we would say in that is that they're trying to meet a need of theirs, but they don't know how, and therefore they're being difficult. If they had the right skills and tools, they would be able to articulate their need in a way that's more digestible. So I think what it is trying, once again, going back to what they're trying to say that they want, to go back to that deeper need and unfurling that.
Yeah.
But a lot of people, struggle with that. But I think to Anne's point, I think if you're not in the right emotional headspace to hear their pain, you shouldn't have the conversation.
I think you've got to understand their pain points and how they're receiving the message. I don't talk about personality as much. I think it comes back to what is it that they're wanting, so that we drill down to, because often when we stop and listen and ask those questions, what we thought they were asking is different to what they're now asking.
Everyone's sort of got a motive. Just finally, Anne, I might ask you about this one. In terms of multiculturalism in the workplace, we obviously see a lot of this. How do you sort of communicate with different cultures if they have different etiquettes? Is there sort of a universal rule you can use across the board?
I think that one universal principle is politeness. It comes back to what Kamal just said. If you're building a rapport through smiling and facial gesture and so on and listening to them, they know that you're making an attempt, even though you might not have understood what was meant by what was said.
Kamal, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, you know, once again, working all around the world, I think we all have a deep human need to connect. And unfortunately loneliness is becoming epidemic, but be it in the workplace or be it at home, once you can create that connection, like Anne said, you just start to release, you know, and I think you find that all over the world, that we desperately we can connect as human beings.
All right, we'll have to leave it there, but Professor Anne Brewer and Kamal Summer, thank you so much for joining us today on the show.
Pleasure.
We do have to take a quick